Have you ever wondered what it took to become the most powerful man in 12th century Europe? Have you ever thought about the price of ambition in an age of swords and crowns? This is the story of Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded emperor who fought for glory across the Alps, a man who became a legend. The man who would become Frederick Barbarossa entered the world during a time of chaos. Germany was tearing itself apart in civil war. His family fought desperately to claim what they believed was their rightful inheritance. Into this turbulent world, a child was born who would one day reshape European history. The exact date of Frederick's birth remains uncertain. Medieval record-keeping was not precise about such matters. Historians generally place his birth around the year 1122. Some suggest it might have been a year or two earlier or later. What we know for certain is that he was born into one of the most powerful families in Germany. His father was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia. This elder Frederick was a formidable figure. He had inherited the duchy from his own father. He had fought alongside his brother Conrad in the civil wars against Emperor Lothar. He was known as a brave warrior and a skilled politician. Young Frederick's mother was equally significant. Judith came from the Welf family, the great rivals of the Hohenstaufen. Her brother was Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria. Her family controlled vast territories in southern Germany. The marriage between Frederick's parents had been intended to reduce tensions between the two dynasties. This dual heritage would prove crucial to young Frederick's future. He could claim connection to both of the great rival families. Hohenstaufen blood flowed through his veins from his father. Welf blood came from his mother. This made him uniquely positioned to bridge the divide that split Germany. The young Frederick grew up in the castles and courts of Swabia. His childhood home was likely Staufen Castle, the ancestral seat that gave his family their name. He would have also spent time at other Hohenstaufen strongholds, Weiblingen, Hagenau, and others. These castles were centres of power and culture. Life in a medieval castle was not comfortable by modern standards. The stone walls were cold in winter. Heating came from fireplaces that could not warm entire rooms. Windows were small to keep out enemies, which also kept out light. Rushes covered the floors. Tapestries hung on walls, as much for warmth as for decoration. But for a young noble, castle life had its advantages. Frederick would have been surrounded by servants and attendants. He would have eaten well, at least by the standards of the time. Meat, bread, cheese and wine were regular features of noble tables. The young boy wanted for nothing material. Education for a noble child in the 12th century focused on practical skills. Frederick learned to ride horses almost as soon as he could walk. Horsemanship was essential for any medieval lord. Battles were fought on horseback. Travel was done on horseback. A noble who could not ride was no noble at all. Weapons training began early. Young Frederick learned to handle a sword. He practiced with lance and shield. He trained in the arts of war that would define his adult life. These skills were not optional for a boy of his station. They were matters of survival. But Frederick's education went beyond warfare. Noble children also learned the basics of reading and writing. Latin was the language of the church and of official documents. Frederick would have studied Latin grammar and vocabulary. He learned to read religious texts and legal documents. The young Frederick also absorbed the culture of his time. He heard tales of ancient heroes and recent warriors. The songs of troubadours filled castle halls, stories of Charlemagne and Roland, of Arthur and his knights. These legends shaped how medieval people thought about honour, courage and kingship. Religion played a central role in Frederick's upbringing. The medieval world was saturated with faith. Every day began and ended with prayers. The church calendar structured the year. Feast days and fast days, saints' days and holy seasons. Young Frederick learned the beliefs and practices of medieval Christianity. He would have attended Mass regularly. He would have confessed his sins to priests. He would have learned about heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. The Church taught that earthly rulers held their power from God. This idea would shape Frederick's understanding of his own role as king and emperor. The civil wars that raged during Frederick's childhood must have affected him deeply. His father and uncle fought against Emperor Lothar. Armies marched across Swabia. Battles were fought, men died. The young boy would have seen warriors departing for combat. He would have heard news of victories and defeats. These experiences taught Frederick important lessons. He learned that power must be fought for. He learned that enemies could be found even within one's own realm. He learned that loyalty and betrayal were constant possibilities. These hard truths would guide his actions throughout his life. Frederick's father died in 1147. The elder Frederick had accompanied King Conrad on the disastrous Second Crusade. He fell ill during the campaign and never recovered. His death left young Frederick as Duke of Swabia. At roughly 25 years of age, Frederick became one of the most important nobles in Germany. The young Duke quickly proved his capabilities. He managed his territories effectively. He maintained good relations with his royal uncle. He showed the political skill that would later make him famous. King Conrad came to rely on his nephew more and more. Frederick also demonstrated his military abilities. He participated in campaigns to maintain order in Germany. He led troops in minor conflicts. He gained experience in the practical realities of medieval warfare. This experience would serve him well in the years to come. The relationship between Frederick and his uncle Conrad grew increasingly close. The king had a son, but the boy was young and untested. Conrad worried about the future of his dynasty. He saw in Frederick a worthy successor, someone who could hold the empire together after his death. As Conrad's health declined, he made his wishes known. He wanted Frederick to succeed him. The dying king believed his nephew was the best hope for the Hohenstaufen family. He believed Frederick could heal the divisions in Germany. He believed Frederick could make the empire great again. When Conrad died in February 1152, Frederick was ready. He had spent years preparing for this moment. He had built alliances. He had proven his worth. He had earned the respect of nobles across Germany. The electors gathered at Frankfurt and chose him as their new king. The election was remarkably smooth. There was no serious opposition. The great nobles recognized Frederick's qualities. They saw in him a leader who could bring stability. They hoped he would end the civil wars that had plagued Germany for decades. Frederick was crowned King of Germany at Aachen on March 9th, 1152. Aachen held special significance. It was the city of Charlemagne. The great emperor of the Franks had made it his capital. By being crowned there, Frederick connected himself to that glorious past. He presented himself as Charlemagne's heir. The new king was in the prime of life. Contemporary descriptions paint a picture of a vigorous, impressive man. He was of medium height, well-built and strong. His most distinctive feature was his reddish-blonde beard. This beard would earn him his famous nickname from the Italians. Frederick had blue eyes and a fair complexion. His hair was curly. He carried himself with confidence and authority. Those who met him were impressed by his bearing. He looked like a king, and he acted like one. But appearance was only part of Frederick's appeal. He was also known for his intelligence and energy. He could work long hours without tiring. He paid attention to details. He remembered faces and names. He made people feel important when he spoke with them. Frederick was also known for his sense of justice. He believed strongly in law and order. He wanted disputes settled through proper legal processes. He disliked arbitrary violence and chaos. This commitment to justice would shape his policies throughout his reign. At the same time, Frederick could be ruthless when necessary. He did not hesitate to punish those who defied him. He could be harsh to enemies and rebels. He understood that a king must sometimes inspire fear as well as respect. This combination of justice and severity made him an effective ruler. The young king's personal life also took shape during these years. Frederick married Adelaide of Vohburg shortly before becoming king. This marriage was a political alliance. Adelaide came from a respected noble family. The union strengthened Frederick's position in Germany. But the marriage was not happy. Frederick and Adelaide had no children together. This was a serious problem for a medieval king. Without an heir, the succession would be uncertain. Frederick's dynasty might end with him. Eventually, Frederick would seek to end this marriage. He would claim that he and Adelaide were too closely related. Such claims were common ways to dissolve medieval marriages. The church would eventually grant an annulment. Frederick would remarry and produce the heirs his dynasty needed. But that lay in the future. For now, the newly crowned king focused on consolidating his power. He needed to establish himself firmly on the throne. He needed to win the loyalty of the great nobles. He needed to prepare for the challenges ahead. One of Frederick's first acts as king was to reconcile with the Welf family. His cousin Henry the Lion had grown into a powerful young duke. Henry controlled Saxony and claimed Bavaria. He was potentially the most dangerous noble in Germany. Frederick chose conciliation over confrontation. He restored Bavaria to Henry. He treated his cousin with respect and honour. In return, Henry became Frederick's loyal supporter. The two young men formed an alliance that would last for decades. This reconciliation was a political masterstroke. It ended the Hohenstaufen-Welf conflict that had divided Germany for a generation. It united the two most powerful families behind the throne. It allowed Frederick to focus on other challenges without worrying about civil war. Frederick also worked to strengthen his relationship with the church. He confirmed the privileges of bishops and monasteries. He showed respect for religious institutions. He presented himself as a defender of the faith. The church, in turn, supported his claim to the imperial crown. The imperial crown. This was Frederick's ultimate goal. Being king of Germany was important, but it was not enough. The supreme title in Christendom was Holy Roman Emperor. To claim that title, Frederick needed to travel to Rome. He needed to be crowned by the Pope himself. Frederick began planning his Italian expedition almost immediately. He gathered information about conditions south of the Alps. He communicated with potential allies in Italy. He assessed the strength of potential enemies. The young king prepared carefully for the greatest challenge of his life. The Italy that Frederick planned to enter was a complex and dangerous place. Northern Italy was home to wealthy and powerful cities. These cities had grown rich through trade and manufacturing. They had developed their own governments and traditions. They did not welcome interference from German kings. The papacy in Rome presented another challenge. The Pope claimed supreme spiritual authority over all Christians. He also claimed political power in central Italy. The relationship between Pope and Emperor was always complicated. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they clashed. Frederick would need to navigate this relationship carefully. Southern Italy was controlled by the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. These descendants of Viking warriors had conquered the region a century earlier. They had created a powerful and sophisticated state. The Sicilian kings were sometimes allies of the empire, sometimes enemies. Their attitude would affect Frederick's Italian plans. All of these factors swirled in Frederick's mind as he prepared for his first Italian campaign. He knew the risks, he knew the potential rewards, he knew that failure could destroy everything his family had built. But he also knew that success could make him the most powerful ruler in Europe. In the autumn of 1154, Frederick led his army south. He crossed the Alps through the Brenner Pass. He descended into the plains of Lombardy. The first Italian campaign of Frederick Barbarossa had begun. The young king who crossed those mountains was about to be transformed. The experiences that awaited him in Italy would shape his character and his reign. He would learn hard lessons about the limits of power. He would discover enemies he had not anticipated. He would achieve triumphs and suffer defeats. But through it all, Frederick would remain true to his vision. He believed in the empire. He believed in his own destiny to rule it. He believed that with enough determination he could overcome any obstacle. This belief would sustain him through decades of struggle. The boy who had grown up amid civil war was now a king. The young duke who had proven himself in minor conflicts was about to face the greatest challenges of his life. Frederick Barbarossa was ready to make his mark on history. The path that led Frederick to the throne was paved with conflict and cunning. Germany in the early 12th century was a land divided against itself. Great families struggled for supremacy. Armies clashed across the countryside. The imperial crown passed from hand to hand amid chaos and bloodshed. To understand how Frederick became king, we must first understand the crisis that preceded his reign. The Salian dynasty had ruled the empire for over a century. These emperors had built a powerful state. They had expanded imperial authority. They had clashed with popes and nobles alike. But in 1125, the last Salian emperor died without an heir. Henry V left no children. His death created a succession crisis. The great nobles who served as electors had to choose a new emperor. This was their right and their responsibility. But they did not agree on who should wear the crown. The Hohenstaufen family believed they had the strongest claim. Frederick's grandfather had married the daughter of an emperor. The family had served the Salians loyally for generations. They expected the throne to pass to them. But the electors had other ideas. They feared Hohenstaufen power. They worried that a Hohenstaufen emperor would be too strong. They preferred a weaker candidate, someone they could control. They chose Lothar of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Lothar was capable enough. He had proven himself as a military commander. He had administrative experience from governing Saxony, but he was not connected to the previous dynasty. He was not the obvious choice. His election was a deliberate rejection of Hohenstaufen claims. The Hohenstaufen refused to accept this decision. Frederick's grandfather, Duke Frederick of Swabia, raised the banner of rebellion. His brother Conrad joined him. Together, they challenged Lothar's right to rule. Civil war erupted across Germany. This conflict lasted for years. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Lothar had the legitimacy of his election. The Hohenstaufen had the strength of their conviction. Armies marched and countermarched. Castles changed hands. The empire bled. Young Frederick was born into this chaos. His earliest years were shaped by war. He grew up knowing that his family fought for what they believed was rightfully theirs. This experience marked him deeply. It taught him that power must be seized and defended. The civil war gradually wound down without a clear resolution. Lothar remained emperor, but the Hohenstaufen remained defiant. An uneasy truce settled over Germany. Both sides watched each other with suspicion. The peace was fragile. Everyone knew it could shatter at any moment. The great families nursed their grievances. They waited for the next opportunity to strike. During these years of uneasy peace, young Frederick grew from a child into a youth. He learned the skills expected of a noble son. He trained with weapons. He studied the arts of war. He absorbed the political lessons that surrounded him. His family struggle became his own struggle. The elder Frederick, his father, continued to govern Swabia. The Duke maintained his family's position despite the setbacks they had suffered. He kept his territories secure. He preserved his alliances. He waited for circumstances to change. Lothar of Supplinburg proved to be a competent emperor. He restored some order to the empire. He dealt with external threats. He managed the complicated relationship with the papacy, but he could never fully overcome the opposition of the Hohenstaufen. His reign remained contested. Lothar also had his own succession problems. He had no sons. His only daughter had married Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria. This Henry was the head of the Welf family. He was ambitious, powerful, and arrogant. He expected to inherit the empire through his wife. When Lothar died in 1137, the succession question arose again. Henry the Proud believed the throne was his. He had the support of his father-in-law's followers. He controlled vast territories in both Bavaria and Saxony. He seemed unstoppable. But the electors once again surprised everyone. They did not want Henry the Proud as emperor. They feared his power and his pride. They remembered how they had rejected the Hohenstaufen 12 years earlier. Now they rejected the Welfs as well. Instead, the electors chose Conrad of Hohenstaufen. This was Frederick's uncle, the brother of his father. Conrad had proven himself during the civil wars. He was capable and determined, and he represented a family that had been wrongly denied the throne. Conrad III became the first Hohenstaufen emperor. The family had finally achieved their goal. Decades of struggle had paid off. The Hohenstaufen sat on the imperial throne at last, but their triumph brought new challenges. Henry the Proud refused to accept Conrad's election. He raised his armies in rebellion. The civil war that had quieted under Lothar erupted again with renewed fury. Conrad moved quickly against his rival. He declared Henry an outlaw. He stripped him of his duchies. Bavaria was given to Leopold of Austria. Saxony was granted to Albert the Bear. Henry the Proud found himself suddenly dispossessed. The proud duke fought back desperately, but fortune turned against him. In 1139, Henry the Proud died. His young son, also named Henry, inherited his claims. This boy would grow up to become Henry the Lion, one of the most remarkable figures of the age. The death of Henry the Proud did not end the conflict. His supporters continued to fight. The Welf cause passed to his brother Welf VI and to his young son. The civil war dragged on year after year. Young Frederick watched these events unfold. He saw his uncle struggle to maintain control of the empire. He saw the endless warfare that consumed Germany. He learned that being emperor was not enough. One had to constantly fight to remain emperor. Frederick's father died in 1147. The elder Frederick had accompanied King Conrad on the Second Crusade. The expedition to the Holy Land was a disaster. Conrad's army was ambushed and destroyed in Anatolia. Many German nobles perished. Among them was the Duke of Swabia. Young Frederick inherited his father's duchy. At roughly 25 years of age, he became one of the most powerful nobles in Germany. The responsibility was enormous, but Frederick proved equal to the challenge. The new Duke of Swabia governed his territories well. He maintained order in his lands. He supported his uncle, the emperor. He demonstrated the qualities that would later make him famous. King Conrad watched his nephew with growing approval. Conrad himself had returned from the crusade, a broken man. The disaster in the east had shattered his health and his reputation. He spent his remaining years trying to restore order in Germany. He had some success, but his strength was failing. The king worried about the succession. His son Frederick was young and untested. Conrad feared that a child emperor would be unable to hold the realm together. The civil wars might resume. Everything the Hohenstaufen had built might be destroyed. Conrad looked to his nephew as a possible solution. Duke Frederick of Swabia had proven himself capable. He had the energy and skill to rule effectively, and he had one crucial advantage that Conrad's own son lacked. Frederick's mother was Judith of the Welf family. Through her, Frederick was connected to the Hohenstaufen's greatest rivals. He had Welf blood as well as Hohenstaufen blood. He might be able to reconcile the two factions. He might be able to heal the wounds that had torn Germany apart. As Conrad lay dying in February 1152, he made his wishes known. He recommended his nephew Frederick as his successor. He passed over his own young son. He believed this was best for the family and for the empire. The great nobles gathered at Frankfurt to choose a new king. The election took place in early March 1152. The outcome was never really in doubt. Conrad's recommendation carried enormous weight. Frederick had already proven his worth. The electors chose him unanimously. Frederick of Hohenstaufen became King of Germany. He was crowned at Aachen on March 9th, 1152. The ceremony took place in the church that Charlemagne had built. Frederick sat on Charlemagne's throne. He presented himself as the heir of that legendary emperor. The new king faced immediate challenges. Germany remained divided. The Welf faction still nursed their grievances. The great nobles had grown accustomed to independence. The church demanded respect for its privileges. And beyond the Alps, Italy beckoned with its promises and its dangers. Frederick moved quickly to address these challenges. His first priority was reconciliation with the Welfs. His cousin Henry the Lion had grown into a formidable young duke. Henry controlled Saxony and claimed Bavaria. He was potentially Frederick's most dangerous rival, but Frederick chose a different approach. Instead of fighting Henry, he embraced him. He restored Bavaria to Welf control. He treated his cousin with honour and respect. He made Henry his ally rather than his enemy. This decision transformed German politics. The Hohenstaufen-Welf conflict that had raged for decades suddenly ended. The two most powerful families in Germany united behind the throne. Frederick had achieved through diplomacy what his predecessors had failed to achieve through war. The reconciliation with Henry the Lion was a political masterstroke. It demonstrated Frederick's wisdom and flexibility. It showed that he could make peace as well as war. It freed him to pursue his larger ambitions without worrying about civil conflict. Frederick also worked to strengthen his relationship with the church. He confirmed the privileges of bishops and monasteries. He showed respect for religious authority. He presented himself as a pious Christian ruler. The church, in turn, supported his plans. With Germany stabilized, Frederick could turn his attention to Italy. The imperial crown awaited him in Rome. But to reach Rome, he would have to deal with the complex politics of the Italian peninsula. He would have to navigate between rival cities, ambitious nobles, and the papacy itself. Frederick began preparing for his Italian expedition almost immediately. He gathered his forces. He negotiated with potential allies. He studied the situation south of the Alps. The young king prepared carefully for the greatest challenge of his life. The road to Rome called to Frederick like a siren song. Every German king dreamed of the imperial crown. That crown could only be received in Rome, from the hands of the Pope himself. Frederick was determined to claim it. The autumn of 1154 saw Frederick lead his army south. They crossed the Alps through the Brenner Pass. This route had been used by armies for centuries. Roman legions had marched through these mountains. Charlemagne had crossed here, on his way to be crowned emperor. Now Frederick followed in their footsteps. The crossing was difficult, but not dangerous. Frederick had chosen his timing carefully. The autumn weather was still mild. The passes were clear of snow. His army made good progress through the mountains. As they descended into the plains of Lombardy, Frederick entered a different world. Italy was not like Germany. The climate was warmer. The cities were larger and wealthier. The political situation was far more complicated. Northern Italy in the 12th century was dominated by its cities. Milan, Pavia, Cremona, Brescia, and many others. These cities had grown rich through trade and manufacturing. They had developed sophisticated governments. They jealously guarded their independence. The Italian cities did not form a unified bloc. They competed fiercely with each other. Old rivalries divided them. Milan fought against Pavia. Cremona opposed Brescia. These conflicts created opportunities for a clever ruler to exploit. Frederick understood this situation. He knew he could not simply impose his will on Italy. He would have to work with some cities against others. He would have to balance competing interests. He would have to be both warrior and diplomat. The king's first major stop was at Roncaglia. This was a traditional meeting place for German rulers and their Italian subjects. Frederick held a great assembly there. He received the homage of many Italian nobles and cities. He listened to complaints and dispensed justice. At Roncaglia, Frederick began to articulate his vision of imperial authority. He believed the emperor held supreme power over all of Italy. He believed the cities owed him obedience and tribute. He believed he had the right to intervene in their affairs. This vision would bring him into conflict with the cities. They had different ideas about their relationship with the empire. They acknowledged the emperor's theoretical supremacy, but they wanted to govern themselves. They did not want German interference in their daily affairs. For now, these tensions remained beneath the surface. Frederick was new to Italy. He was still learning its complexities. The cities were willing to show him respect, at least initially. The real conflicts would come later. From Roncaglia, Frederick moved south. His goal was Rome and the imperial crown. But he had business to attend to along the way. The Pope had asked for his help against certain enemies. Frederick was happy to oblige. The papacy in 1154 was held by Adrian IV. This was the only Englishman ever to become pope. Adrian was a capable and determined leader. He faced serious challenges to his authority. He needed Frederick's military support. One of Adrian's problems was the city of Rome itself. A revolutionary movement had taken control of the city, led by a preacher named Arnold of Brescia. This movement challenged papal authority. Arnold preached that the church should give up its wealth and political power. His followers had driven the Pope from Rome. Frederick agreed to deal with Arnold of Brescia. This was a service to the Pope. It was also in Frederick's own interest. He did not want revolutionaries controlling the city where he would be crowned. He wanted order and stability. As Frederick approached Rome, Arnold of Brescia was captured. The revolutionary preacher was handed over to papal authorities. He was tried, condemned, and executed. His body was burned and the ashes thrown into the Tiber River. The threat he represented was eliminated. With Arnold gone, the way to Rome was clear. Frederick and his army approached the ancient city. Pope Adrian came out to meet him. The encounter between king and pope was carefully choreographed. Every gesture carried symbolic meaning. According to tradition, the king was supposed to hold the pope's stirrup and lead his horse. This was a sign of respect for papal authority. Frederick initially refused to perform this service. He did not want to appear subordinate to the pope. The dispute caused a brief crisis. Adrian refused to give Frederick the kiss of peace until the traditional ceremony was performed. Negotiations followed. Eventually, Frederick agreed to hold the stirrup. He did so, but he made clear that it was a gesture of courtesy, not submission. This incident revealed the tensions that would define Frederick's relationship with the papacy. Both emperor and pope claimed supreme authority. Both believed they represented God's will on earth. Their competing claims would lead to decades of conflict, but for now, cooperation prevailed. On June 18, 1154, Frederick entered Rome. He proceeded to St. Peter's Basilica. There Pope Adrian placed the imperial crown on his head. Frederick of Hohenstaufen became Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor. The coronation was a moment of supreme triumph. Frederick had achieved what his family had sought for generations. He held the highest title in Christendom. He was the successor of Charlemagne and the ancient Roman emperors. He was the theoretical ruler of the Christian world. But the ceremony was marred by violence. The Roman people had not been consulted about the coronation. They resented the presence of German troops in their city. As Frederick left St. Peter's, fighting broke out. The Romans attacked the German soldiers. Street battles raged through the city. Many people were killed on both sides. Frederick's men eventually restored order, but the violence cast a shadow over the day. The emperor did not linger in Rome. He had achieved his immediate goal. The imperial crown was his, but he did not have the strength to hold the city against a hostile population. He withdrew northward with his army. Frederick's first Italian campaign had been successful in its main objective. He was now emperor. He had established his presence in Italy. He had made alliances with various cities and nobles. He had demonstrated his power. But the campaign also revealed the challenges that lay ahead. The Italian cities were not going to submit easily. The Romans had shown their hostility. Even the Pope, despite the coronation, had his own agenda. Italy would not be pacified quickly or easily. Frederick returned to Germany in the autumn of 1155. He had been away for over a year. His kingdom needed attention. There were disputes to settle, nobles to manage, policies to implement. The emperor threw himself into the work of governing. The years following his coronation were productive for Frederick. He strengthened royal authority in Germany. He resolved conflicts between nobles. He promoted economic development. He established his court as a centre of culture and learning. Frederick also began planning his next Italian campaign. He knew that one expedition was not enough. The cities of Lombardy remained largely independent. The Pope's cooperation could not be taken for granted. More work was needed to establish real imperial control. The emperor gathered information about Italian affairs. He corresponded with allies south of the Alps. He assessed the strength of potential opponents. He calculated what forces he would need for a more ambitious campaign. Frederick also dealt with personal matters during these years. His marriage to Adelaide of Vaubourg had produced no children. This was a serious problem. Without an heir, the succession would be uncertain. The Hohenstaufen dynasty might end with Frederick. The emperor decided to end his marriage. He claimed that he and Adelaide were too closely related. This was a common justification for dissolving medieval marriages. The church investigated and eventually granted an annulment. Frederick was now free to remarry. He needed a wife who could give him heirs. He also wanted a marriage that would strengthen his political position. He found both in Beatrice of Burgundy. Beatrice was the daughter of Count Rainald of Burgundy. More importantly, she was the heiress to the county of Burgundy. This territory lay between Germany and France. It was strategically valuable. By marrying Beatrice, Frederick gained control of these lands. The wedding took place in 1156. It was a grand celebration. Nobles from across the empire attended. The ceremony demonstrated Frederick's power and prestige. It also began a marriage that would prove both politically and personally successful. Beatrice would bear Frederick many children, sons to continue his dynasty, daughters to forge alliances through marriage. The succession was secured. The Hohenstaufen future was assured. With his personal affairs settled, Frederick could focus on his imperial ambitions. Italy continued to call to him. The wealth of the Lombard cities, the prestige of ruling Rome, the dream of a truly unified empire. These goals drove Frederick forward. In 1158, Frederick launched his second Italian campaign. This expedition was larger and more ambitious than the first. Frederick brought a powerful army. He intended to establish lasting imperial authority over northern Italy. The emperor crossed the Alps in the summer of 1158. His forces descended into Lombardy like a flood. City after city submitted to his authority. Those that resisted faced the consequences. Milan was the greatest prize and the greatest challenge. This city was the largest and wealthiest in Lombardy. It dominated the surrounding region. It had resisted imperial authority for years. Frederick was determined to bring it to heel. The siege of Milan began in August 1158. Frederick's army surrounded the city. They cut off supplies. They launched attacks against the walls. The Milanese defended themselves stubbornly, but Milan could not hold out forever. After a month of siege, the city surrendered. The Milanese agreed to accept imperial authority. They paid a heavy fine. They gave hostages as guarantees of their good behaviour. Frederick had achieved a major victory. From Milan, Frederick moved to Roncaglia. He held another great assembly there. This assembly would prove to be one of the most important events of his reign. At the Diet of Roncaglia in November 1158, Frederick proclaimed a comprehensive statement of imperial rights. He drew on Roman law to justify his claims. He asserted that the emperor held supreme authority over all of Italy. He claimed the right to appoint officials, collect taxes, and administer justice. These claims went far beyond what the Italian cities were willing to accept. They had governed themselves for generations. They had their own laws and customs. They did not want German officials telling them what to do. The Roncaglia decrees planted the seeds of future conflict. For now, the cities submitted. Frederick's army was too powerful to resist, but resentment smouldered beneath the surface. It would eventually burst into open rebellion. Frederick spent the following years trying to enforce his Roncaglia decrees. He appointed imperial officials to govern the cities. He collected taxes and tolls. He intervened in local disputes. He made his presence felt throughout northern Italy. This policy brought him into conflict with Milan once again. The Milanese chafed under imperial control. They resented the officials Frederick had imposed on them. They began to resist his authority. Frederick responded with force. In 1159 he laid siege to the small town of Crema, an ally of Milan. The siege lasted for months. It was marked by terrible brutality on both sides. Hostages were killed. Prisoners were tortured. The war grew increasingly savage. Crema finally fell in January 1160. Frederick ordered the town destroyed. The walls were torn down. The buildings were demolished. The population was dispersed. Crema ceased to exist as a city. This destruction was meant as a warning to Milan. Frederick wanted the Milanese to see what happened to those who defied him. But the warning had the opposite effect. It convinced the Milanese that they had to fight. Submission meant destruction. The conflict with Milan escalated. Frederick gathered his forces for a final assault. In 1161, he began a siege that would last for 2 years. The Milanese resisted with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Milan surrendered in March 1162. This time, Frederick showed no mercy. He ordered the complete destruction of the city. The walls were torn down, the buildings were demolished, the population was forced to disperse to 4 separate villages. Milan, the greatest city in Lombardy, was wiped from the map. The destruction of Milan shocked all of Italy. Frederick had demonstrated his power in the most dramatic way possible. He had destroyed one of the greatest cities in Europe. No one could doubt his determination or his ruthlessness. But the destruction of Milan was also a mistake. It united Frederick's enemies against him. Cities that had been rivals of Milan now saw the emperor as a common threat. They began to think about resistance. Frederick Barbarossa's relationship with Italy was the defining struggle of his reign. He crossed the Alps 6 times during his rule. He spent years fighting to establish imperial authority over the wealthy cities of Lombardy. His Italian campaigns brought him both his greatest triumphs and his most bitter defeats. The emperor's vision for Italy was ambitious. He believed that as Holy Roman Emperor, he had the right to rule all of the peninsula. He saw himself as the heir of the ancient Roman emperors. He wanted to restore the glory of Rome under German leadership. This vision clashed with Italian reality. The cities of northern Italy had developed their own traditions of self-government. They had elected councils and appointed officials. They made their own laws and collected their own taxes. They did not want to submit to German control. The conflict between imperial ambition and urban independence would dominate Italian politics for decades. Frederick would win battles and lose battles. He would destroy cities and be forced to recognize their rights. In the end, neither side would achieve complete victory. Frederick's second Italian campaign, which we have already discussed, established his power in Lombardy. The destruction of Milan demonstrated his willingness to use extreme measures. For a time, the other cities submitted to his authority. But submission did not mean acceptance. The Lombard cities resented imperial control. They waited for an opportunity to throw off the German yoke. That opportunity would come sooner than Frederick expected. The papacy played a crucial role in Italian affairs. The Pope claimed both spiritual and temporal authority. He ruled central Italy directly. He influenced politics throughout the peninsula. His relationship with the emperor was always complicated. Frederick's relationship with the papacy deteriorated after his coronation. Pope Adrian IV died in 1159. His death triggered a disputed election. 2 candidates claimed to be the legitimate pope. Frederick supported one. Most of the cardinals supported the other. The candidate supported by the cardinals took the name Alexander III. He was a skilled diplomat and a determined defender of papal rights. He would be Frederick's opponent for the next 2 decades. Frederick refused to recognize Alexander. He supported a series of rival popes known as anti-popes. This schism divided the church. It complicated politics throughout Europe. It gave Frederick's enemies a powerful ally. Pope Alexander excommunicated Frederick. This was the most serious punishment the church could impose. It meant that Frederick was cut off from the sacraments. It released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. It made him an outcast in Christian society. The excommunication had practical effects as well as spiritual ones. It gave legitimacy to those who opposed Frederick. It allowed them to claim they were fighting for the church against a tyrant. It strengthened the resistance in Italy. Frederick launched his third Italian campaign in 1163. He came with a large army. He intended to crush resistance and capture Pope Alexander. But things did not go as planned. The campaign started well enough. Frederick moved through Lombardy without serious opposition. He approached Rome, hoping to install his anti-pope and capture Alexander. But Alexander fled to France before Frederick could reach him. Without the pope to capture, Frederick's campaign lost its main objective. He spent months in Italy without achieving anything decisive. Disease began to spread through his army. Many soldiers died. Frederick was forced to retreat. The failed campaign encouraged resistance. The Lombard cities saw that Frederick was not invincible. They began to organize against him. Secret negotiations took place between cities that had been rivals. A new alliance was forming. In 1167, Frederick launched his fourth Italian campaign. This was the largest expedition he had yet undertaken. He brought a massive army across the Alps. He was determined to end resistance once and for all. The campaign began with stunning success. Frederick defeated a papal army at the Battle of Tusculum. He captured Rome itself. He installed his antipope in the Vatican. Pope Alexander fled once again. It seemed that Frederick had finally achieved his goals. But then disaster struck. A terrible plague swept through Frederick's army. Thousands of soldiers died within days. The epidemic killed many of Frederick's most important supporters. Reinald of Dassel, his chancellor and closest adviser, perished. Frederick himself barely escaped. The emperor fled northward with the remnants of his army. He tried to return to Germany, but the Alpine passes were blocked. The Lombard cities had risen in rebellion behind him. He was trapped in Italy with a shattered army. Frederick spent months trying to escape. He had to sneak through hostile territory. He disguised himself to avoid capture. He faced dangers at every turn. It was the lowest point of his reign. Eventually, Frederick made it back to Germany, but he had lost most of his army. He had lost many of his best men. He had lost control of Italy. The cities he had conquered were free again. The Pope he had driven out was returning. Everything he had built was collapsing. The years following the disaster of 1167 were difficult for Frederick. He had to rebuild his strength in Germany. He had to deal with problems at home. He could not immediately return to Italy. His enemies had time to organize. The Lombard cities used this time well. They formed a formal alliance called the Lombard League. This league included most of the major cities of northern Italy. Milan was rebuilt and joined the league. The cities agreed to support each other against imperial aggression. The Lombard League was a formidable opponent. The combined resources of the cities far exceeded what any single city could muster. They could raise large armies. They could sustain long campaigns. They were fighting for their homes and their freedom. Pope Alexander supported the Lombard League. He blessed their cause. He provided them with moral authority. He helped coordinate their efforts. The alliance between the Pope and the cities created a powerful coalition against Frederick. The League built a new city as a symbol of their resistance. They called it Alessandria, after Pope Alexander. The city was constructed in a strategic location. It was designed to block imperial armies moving through Lombardy. It was a deliberate challenge to Frederick's authority. Frederick could not ignore this challenge. In 1174 he launched his fifth Italian campaign. He came with another large army. His goal was to destroy the Lombard League and reassert imperial control. The campaign began with the siege of Alessandria. Frederick was determined to destroy this symbol of resistance. He surrounded the city with his army. He launched assault after assault, but Alessandria held firm. The siege dragged on for months. Frederick tried every tactic he knew. He built siege towers. He dug tunnels under the walls. He launched night attacks, nothing worked. The defenders of Alessandria refused to surrender. Spring rains turned the ground to mud. Disease spread through Frederick's camp. His soldiers grew discouraged. The siege was failing. Frederick had to find another way to defeat his enemies. The emperor tried diplomacy. He negotiated with the Lombard League. He offered concessions in exchange for peace. But the negotiations broke down. Neither side was willing to compromise enough. Frederick decided to seek battle. He would defeat the League's army in open combat. He would prove that his forces were superior. He gathered his troops and marched to confront the enemy. The Lombard League represented something new in medieval politics. It was an alliance of cities, not nobles. It was based on shared interests, not feudal obligations. It showed that urban communities could organize effectively to resist even the most powerful rulers. The League included cities that had been bitter rivals. Milan and Pavia had fought each other for generations. Cremona and Brescia had their own feuds. But the threat from Frederick forced them to set aside their differences. They united against a common enemy. The organization of the League was sophisticated. Each city contributed soldiers and money according to its size and wealth. A council of representatives made decisions for the alliance. Military commanders were appointed to lead combined forces. The League functioned like a small state. The cities had good reasons to resist Frederick. His Roncallia decrees threatened their independence. His appointed officials interfered in their affairs. His taxes drained their wealth. His destruction of Milan showed what happened to those who defied him. But the cities also had positive goals. They wanted to preserve their traditional rights. They wanted to govern themselves according to their own customs. They wanted to control their own trade and commerce. They were fighting for a way of life. The League's military strength came from its urban militias. Every city had citizens trained for war. These were not professional soldiers, but they were motivated fighters. They were defending their homes and families. They fought with determination. The cities also hired mercenaries to supplement their militias. Professional soldiers from across Italy joined the League's armies. These mercenaries provided expertise and experience. They helped train the citizen soldiers. They formed the core of the League's fighting force. The League's strategy was defensive. They did not try to invade Germany or destroy Frederick's power at its source. They simply wanted to keep him out of Italy. They fortified their cities. They blocked the mountain passes. They made it as difficult as possible for imperial armies to operate. Pope Alexander III provided crucial support to the League. He legitimized their resistance. He called on Christians throughout Europe to support them. He excommunicated Frederick and released his subjects from their oaths. He made the conflict a religious as well as a political struggle. The Pope also provided diplomatic support. He negotiated with other European powers on the League's behalf. He helped coordinate strategy. He kept the alliance together when internal disputes threatened to tear it apart. His leadership was essential to the League's success. The construction of Alessandria was the League's boldest move. Building a new city was an enormous undertaking. It required vast resources and coordinated efforts, but the League was determined to create a permanent symbol of their resistance. Alessandria was built on the site of several small villages. The location was chosen for its strategic value. It controlled important routes through Lombardy. An imperial army could not move freely while Alessandria stood in its way. The city was constructed quickly. Walls were built. Houses were erected. A population was gathered from surrounding areas. Within a few years, Alessandria was a functioning city. It stood as a challenge to Frederick's authority. Frederick understood the threat that Alessandria represented. He could not allow this city to exist. It mocked his power. It encouraged further resistance. It had to be destroyed. The siege of Alessandria in 1174 and 1175 was a test of wills. Frederick threw everything he had against the city. The defenders held firm. Months passed without a breakthrough. The emperor grew increasingly frustrated. The failure at Alessandria damaged Frederick's prestige. He had proclaimed that he would destroy the city. He had failed to do so. His enemies took heart. His allies began to doubt. The balance of power was shifting. Frederick needed reinforcements. He sent messages to Germany calling for more troops. He particularly called on his cousin, Henry the Lion. Henry controlled the largest and most powerful territories in Germany. His support could turn the tide. But Henry refused to come. The Duke of Saxony and Bavaria had his own concerns. He was expanding his power in northern Germany. He was building his own empire on the Baltic coast. He did not want to waste his resources on Frederick's Italian adventures. Henry's refusal was a turning point. Frederick had counted on his cousin's support. Without it, he did not have enough strength to defeat the Lombard League. He would have to face his enemies with the forces he had. The emperor lifted the siege of Alessandria. He needed to regroup and reconsider his strategy. He tried once more to negotiate with the League. Once more, the negotiations failed. There was no alternative to battle. Frederick gathered his remaining forces. He had perhaps 10,000 men. It was not a large army by the standards of his earlier campaigns, but it was what he had. He would have to make it enough. The Lombard League also prepared for battle. They gathered their forces from across northern Italy. They had perhaps 12,000 men. More importantly, they had the advantage of fighting on their own ground. They knew the terrain. They had the support of the local population. The two armies manoeuvred through Lombardy in the spring of 1176. Frederick sought favourable ground for battle. The League tried to catch him at a disadvantage. Both sides knew that the coming battle would be decisive. The Battle of Legnano was fought on May 29th, 1176. It was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The outcome would shape the future of Italy and the empire. For Frederick Barbarossa, it would be the greatest defeat of his life. The battle took place near the town of Legnano, northwest of Milan. Frederick had been marching to join reinforcements coming from Germany. The Lombard League moved to intercept him. The two armies met unexpectedly. Frederick had only a portion of his forces with him. Many of his troops were still scattered across the countryside. He faced the full strength of the Lombard League with an inferior force, but Frederick was a warrior. He chose to fight. The emperor led his cavalry in a charge against the League's lines. The German knights were the best heavy cavalry in Europe. They smashed into the Italian infantry with tremendous force. For a moment, it seemed that Frederick might win despite the odds. But the Italians held firm. They had prepared for this moment. They had trained their infantry to resist cavalry charges. They had built a special wagon called the carroccio, which served as a rallying point. Around this wagon, the Milanese infantry formed an unbreakable wall. Frederick himself led charge after charge. He fought with desperate courage. His horse was killed beneath him. He continued fighting on foot. His personal banner was captured by the enemy. Still, he would not retreat. The battle raged for hours. Gradually, the weight of numbers told. The Lombard League surrounded the imperial forces. Frederick's army began to disintegrate. Knights who had fought beside him for years fell or fled. In the chaos, Frederick disappeared. His followers could not find him. Rumours spread that he had been killed. His wife Beatrice, waiting in Pavia, heard that she was a widow. The empire seemed to have lost its ruler. But Frederick was not dead. He had escaped the battlefield in the confusion. He made his way to Pavia with a handful of followers. He arrived at the city gates looking more like a beggar than an emperor, but he was alive. The defeat at Legnano was catastrophic. Frederick had lost his army. He had lost his reputation for invincibility. He had lost control of Lombardy. Everything he had fought for over 2 decades seemed to have slipped away. The emperor had to face reality. He could not defeat the Lombard League by force. He did not have the resources to continue the war. He would have to make peace on whatever terms he could get. Frederick was a proud man. Accepting defeat did not come easily to him, but he was also a practical man. He understood when circumstances had changed. He knew that continuing to fight would only make things worse. The emperor began negotiations with Pope Alexander. This was a significant step. Frederick had refused to recognize Alexander for nearly 20 years. He had supported a series of anti-popes against him. Now he had to accept that Alexander was the legitimate pope. The negotiations were long and difficult. Both sides had grievances, both sides had demands. Frederick wanted to preserve as much of his authority as possible. Alexander wanted guarantees for the church and for the Lombard cities. The first breakthrough came in 1177. Frederick and Alexander met at Venice. The emperor knelt before the pope and kissed his feet. This was a gesture of submission that shocked observers. The proud Barbarossa had humbled himself before his greatest enemy, but the gesture was also a political calculation. By submitting to Alexander, Frederick ended the schism that had divided the church. He regained his place in Christian society. He removed the stain of excommunication. He could present himself once again as a legitimate Christian ruler. The Peace of Venice resolved Frederick's conflict with the papacy, but the conflict with the Lombard League remained. The cities were not willing to simply accept imperial authority. They wanted guarantees for their rights and freedoms. Negotiations with the League continued for several more years. Frederick had learned patience through his defeats. He understood that he could not simply impose his will on the Italian cities. He would have to compromise. He would have to accept less than he had originally demanded. The emperor appointed skilled diplomats to conduct the negotiations. They met with representatives of the Lombard League in various locations. They discussed the details of a possible settlement. They argued over rights and privileges, taxes and appointments, jurisdiction and authority. The cities had their own internal debates. Some wanted to continue resisting until Frederick gave up all his claims. Others were willing to accept a reasonable compromise. The merchants and craftsmen who dominated city politics had practical concerns. They wanted peace so they could return to business. Frederick also faced pressure from his own supporters. The German nobles who had followed him to Italy were tired of endless campaigns. They wanted to go home. They wanted to attend to their own affairs. They urged the emperor to make peace. The years following Legnano saw Frederick adopt a more conciliatory approach. He released prisoners. He reduced his demands. He showed willingness to recognize the city's traditional rights. Slowly, the gap between the two sides narrowed. Frederick also worked to rebuild his position in Germany. The defeat in Italy had weakened his authority at home. Some nobles saw an opportunity to expand their own power. The emperor had to remind them who was in charge. The situation with Henry the Lion became increasingly tense. Frederick had not forgotten his cousin's refusal to help at the critical moment. Henry's absence had contributed to the disaster at Legnano. The emperor harboured deep resentment, but Frederick was too wise to act hastily. He waited for the right moment. He gathered evidence of Henry's misdeeds. He built a coalition of nobles who resented the Duke's power. He prepared his case carefully. Henry the Lion had made many enemies during his years of expansion. He had seized lands from neighbouring lords. He had bullied lesser nobles. He had interfered in church affairs. His arrogance had alienated potential allies. Frederick summoned Henry to answer charges before the imperial court. The Duke refused to appear. He believed himself too powerful to be judged. He underestimated the emperor's determination. The court condemned Henry in his absence. He was stripped of his duchies. Bavaria and Saxony were taken from him. His vast territories were divided among his enemies. The most powerful noble in Germany was brought low. Henry tried to resist. He raised his forces and prepared for war. But he found himself isolated. The nobles he had offended joined against him. Even his own vassals abandoned him. He had no choice but to submit. In 1182, Henry the Lion knelt before Frederick and begged for mercy. The emperor showed some clemency. He did not execute his cousin or imprison him permanently. Instead, he sent Henry into exile. The Duke would spend years in England at the court of his father-in-law, King Henry II. The fall of Henry the Lion transformed German politics. The great wealth power that had balanced the Hohenstaufen was broken. Frederick's authority was unchallenged. He could now focus on completing his settlement with Italy. The Peace of Constance, signed in 1183, marked the end of Frederick's long struggle with the Lombard cities. It was a compromise that gave both sides something they wanted. It established a framework for imperial urban relations that would last for generations. The negotiations leading to Constance were complex. Both sides had to overcome years of bitterness and mistrust. Frederick had destroyed Milan and other cities. The League had humiliated him at Legnano. Neither side had clean hands. But both sides also had reasons to make peace. Frederick wanted to consolidate his position. He was getting older. He wanted to secure his dynasty's future. Endless warfare in Italy served no purpose. The cities wanted stability. War disrupted trade. It destroyed property. It killed citizens. The merchants who dominated city governments understood that peace was good for business. Pope Alexander had died in 1181. His successors were more willing to work with Frederick. The bitter personal conflict between emperor and pope had ended. A new relationship was possible. The Peace of Constance recognized the city's right to self-government. They could elect their own officials. They could make their own laws. They could administer justice according to their own customs. These were the freedoms they had fought for. In return, the cities acknowledged imperial sovereignty. They agreed to pay certain taxes to the emperor. They accepted imperial oversight in some matters. They recognized Frederick as their ultimate lord. The settlement was a victory for the cities in practical terms. They kept the independence they valued most. The imperial authority they acknowledged was largely symbolic. Frederick had given up his dream of direct control over Lombardy, but the settlement was also a victory for Frederick in other ways. It ended a conflict he could not win. It allowed him to focus on other priorities. It preserved the theoretical supremacy of the empire. He could claim success even in compromise. The Peace of Constance also included provisions for Milan. The city that Frederick had destroyed was now formally recognized. Its rights were guaranteed. Its place in the imperial system was secured. Milan would go on to become one of the greatest cities in Europe. Frederick handled the peace settlement with dignity and grace. He did not complain about what he had given up. He did not dwell on past defeats. He presented the agreement as a reasonable solution to a difficult problem. This approach served Frederick well. It allowed him to maintain his prestige despite his concessions. It showed that he was a statesman as well as a warrior. It demonstrated the wisdom that came with age and experience. The years following the Peace of Constance were relatively calm. Frederick focused on governing his empire. He travelled through his territories, dispensing justice and maintaining order. He held great assemblies where nobles gathered to conduct business. The emperor also worked to strengthen his dynasty. His sons were growing up. He needed to provide for their futures. He arranged marriages and granted titles. He built the foundations for Hohenstaufen power in the next generation. Frederick's eldest surviving son was named Henry. This young man was designated as Frederick's heir. He was crowned King of Germany while his father still lived. This was intended to ensure a smooth succession. The emperor also arranged a remarkable marriage for Henry. The young king would wed Constance, the heiress to the Norman kingdom of Sicily. This marriage would unite the empire with southern Italy. It would create a Hohenstaufen domain, stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The Sicilian marriage was a diplomatic triumph. The Norman kingdom was wealthy and sophisticated. It controlled strategic territories. Its addition to the Hohenstaufen realm would transform the balance of power in Europe. But the marriage also created problems for the future. The papacy was alarmed at the prospect of being surrounded by Hohenstaufen territories. German power to the north and south would threaten papal independence. This concern would lead to future conflicts. For now, Frederick could enjoy his achievements. He had survived defeat and disgrace. He had rebuilt his position. He had secured his dynasty's future. He was recognized as one of the great rulers of his age. The emperor was now in his 60s. He had reigned for over 3 decades. He had experienced more than most men could imagine. He had known triumph and disaster, glory and humiliation. He had learned the limits of power and the value of patience. Frederick might have spent his remaining years in peaceful retirement. He had earned rest. He had nothing left to prove. He could have devoted himself to hunting and feasting, to the pleasures appropriate to an aging monarch. But fate had one more adventure in store for Frederick Barbarossa. A call came from the east that he could not ignore. The Holy Land was in danger. Jerusalem had fallen to the Muslims. Christendom needed a champion. The old emperor would answer that call. Frederick Barbarossa's impact on Germany extended far beyond his Italian campaigns. He transformed the empire in ways that would shape its development for centuries. His domestic policies created new institutions, resolved old conflicts, and established patterns of governance that long outlasted his reign. When Frederick became king in 1152, Germany was a fragmented land. The great nobles wielded enormous power. The central government was weak. Civil wars had ravaged the country for decades. The new king faced the challenge of imposing order on chaos. Frederick approached this challenge with a combination of force and diplomacy. He was willing to fight when necessary, but he preferred to negotiate when possible. He understood that lasting peace required the cooperation of the great nobles. He could not simply crush them into submission. The reconciliation with Henry the Lion was the most important example of this approach. By restoring Bavaria to the Welfs, Frederick ended the civil war that had divided Germany. He gained a powerful ally instead of a dangerous enemy. The peace that followed allowed Germany to recover from decades of conflict. Frederick also worked to strengthen the legal foundations of his rule. He promoted the study and application of Roman law. This ancient legal system provided principles for organizing government and resolving disputes. It gave the emperor theoretical justification for his authority. The emperor held great assemblies called diets throughout his reign. These gatherings brought together nobles, churchmen, and other important figures. They provided a forum for discussing policy and resolving conflicts. They helped create a sense of common identity among the empire's diverse territories. At these diets, Frederick dispensed justice. He heard appeals from across the empire. He settled disputes between nobles. He punished criminals and rewarded the faithful. His court became known for its fairness and efficiency. Frederick also promoted economic development. He encouraged trade by protecting merchants and improving roads. He granted privileges to towns that supported him. He understood that a wealthy empire was a strong empire. The emperor founded new towns and expanded existing ones. Urban growth created new sources of revenue. It provided markets for agricultural products. It supported the craftsmen and merchants who drove economic progress. Frederick's reign saw significant urban development throughout Germany. The relationship between the emperor and the church was always complicated. Frederick needed the church's support for legitimacy, but he also wanted to control church appointments and revenues. This tension led to conflicts, but also to compromises. Frederick generally maintained good relations with the German bishops. He confirmed their privileges and protected their interests. In return, they supported his policies and contributed to his military campaigns. This cooperation benefited both sides. The emperor also patronized monasteries and religious houses. He made donations to support their work. He founded new religious institutions. He presented himself as a pious Christian ruler, devoted to the church's welfare. Frederick's court became a centre of culture and learning. Poets and scholars gathered around the emperor. They composed works celebrating his deeds and his dynasty. They helped create an image of Frederick as an ideal Christian ruler. The literature of Frederick's reign reflected the values of chivalric culture. Knights and nobles were expected to embody courage, loyalty, and honour. They were supposed to protect the weak and defend the faith. These ideals shaped how people thought about power and responsibility. Frederick himself embodied these chivalric values. He was known for his personal courage in battle. He was famous for his loyalty to those who served him. He was respected for his sense of justice and fair dealing. He was the model of a medieval king. The emperor's family life also reflected the values of his time. His marriage to Beatrice of Burgundy was both politically advantageous and personally successful. Beatrice bore him many children. She was a trusted partner in governing the empire. Frederick and Beatrice had at least 11 children. Several sons survived to adulthood. This abundance of heirs secured the dynasty's future. It also created potential problems, as brothers might compete for power. The emperor carefully planned for his succession. He designated his eldest son Henry as his heir. He arranged marriages for his other children to build alliances. He distributed lands and titles to provide for all his sons. Frederick's relationship with his sons was complex. He wanted them to succeed, but he also needed to maintain his own authority. He had to balance their ambitions against the needs of the empire. Young Henry was crowned king during his father's lifetime. This was a common practice to ensure smooth succession, but it also created tension. The son wanted real power. The father was not ready to give it up. Despite these tensions, the Hohenstaufen family remained united during Frederick's reign. The emperor's authority was unchallenged. His sons accepted their roles. The dynasty seemed secure for generations to come. Frederick's domestic achievements were substantial. He brought peace to a land torn by civil war. He strengthened royal authority without destroying noble power. He promoted economic growth and cultural development. He created a framework for governance that would endure. But Frederick's legacy was also complicated. His Italian campaigns consumed enormous resources. They distracted attention from German affairs. They created enemies who would trouble his successors. The costs of his ambition were significant. The fall of Henry the Lion illustrated both Frederick's strength and his limitations. The emperor was powerful enough to destroy his greatest rival, but he was not powerful enough to prevent the fragmentation of Henry's territories. The duchies were divided among multiple successors. Central authority was weakened. This pattern would continue after Frederick's death. The great duchies would be broken up further. Noble power would grow at the expense of royal power. The empire would become increasingly decentralized. Frederick's dream of a strong, unified realm would never be fully realized. Still, Frederick's reign marked a high point of medieval German history. He was remembered as a great ruler who brought glory to his people. His name became synonymous with imperial greatness. For centuries, Germans would look back on his reign as a golden age. The legends that grew up around Frederick reflected this admiration. Stories spread that he was not really dead. People said he was sleeping in a mountain cave, waiting to return when Germany needed him. This legend showed how much Frederick meant to his people. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Frederick still had one great adventure before him. The Third Crusade was about to begin. The old emperor would lead his army on one final campaign. It would be the greatest undertaking of his remarkable life. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Holy City had been in Christian hands for nearly 90 years. Now it belonged to the Muslim Sultan Saladin. The news was almost too terrible to believe. Saladin was one of the great military commanders of history. He had united the Muslim lands of Egypt and Syria. He had built a powerful army. He had defeated the Crusader states in battle after battle. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187 destroyed the main Christian army in the east. After Hattin, Saladin swept through the Crusader territories. City after city fell to his forces: Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon. The Christian presence in the Holy Land collapsed. Only a few coastal cities held out. Jerusalem surrendered in October 1187. Saladin treated the Christian inhabitants with relative mercy. He allowed them to ransom themselves and leave the city. But the holy places were now in Muslim hands. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was buried, belonged to the enemy. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief when he heard the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade. Christians everywhere were urged to take up arms. The Holy Land must be recovered. The response was overwhelming. Kings and nobles across Europe pledged to join the crusade. Richard the Lionheart of England took the cross. Philip Augustus of France did the same. And Frederick Barbarossa, the greatest ruler in Christendom, announced that he too would crusade. Frederick was 65 years old in 1187. He had spent decades fighting in Italy. He had survived battles, sieges, and political crises. He had every reason to stay home and enjoy his remaining years in peace. But Frederick could not ignore the call. He was a devout Christian who took his faith seriously. The loss of Jerusalem was a catastrophe that demanded response. As emperor, he had a special responsibility to defend Christendom. There were also practical reasons for Frederick to crusade. A successful expedition would bring glory to his dynasty. It would demonstrate Hohenstaufen leadership of the Christian world. It would cement Frederick's legacy as a great Christian ruler. Frederick began preparing for the crusade immediately. He sent envoys to gather information about conditions in the east. He negotiated with the Byzantine Empire for passage through their territory. He organised the logistics of moving a large army across thousands of miles. The emperor also worked to ensure stability in Germany during his absence. He made arrangements for governing the empire. He settled outstanding disputes. He extracted promises of good behaviour from potentially troublesome nobles. Frederick's preparations were thorough and methodical. He had learned from the disaster of the Second Crusade. He knew that poor planning led to catastrophe. He was determined that his expedition would be different. The emperor set strict standards for those who would join him. Crusaders had to provide their own equipment and supplies. They had to have enough money to support themselves for 2 years. They had to be capable of enduring the hardships of the journey. Frederick did not want a mob. He wanted an army, and these requirements limited the size of Frederick's force, but they ensured its quality. The men who gathered under his banner were experienced warriors. They were properly equipped and supplied. They were ready for the challenges ahead. Estimates of Frederick's army vary widely. Some sources claim he had over 100,000 men. This is certainly an exaggeration. More realistic estimates suggest between 12,000 and 20,000 soldiers. Even the lower figure represented a formidable force. The army included contingents from across the empire. German knights formed the core of the cavalry. Infantry came from various territories. Servants, craftsmen, and other support personnel accompanied the fighting men. It was a complex organisation that required careful management. Frederick also brought churchmen to provide spiritual guidance. Bishops and priests accompanied the army. They celebrated Mass, heard confessions, and administered the sacraments. The crusade was a religious undertaking as well as a military one. The army assembled at Regensburg in May 1189. This city on the Danube was the traditional starting point for journeys to the east. From here, the Crusaders would follow the river valley toward Constantinople. Frederick chose to travel overland rather than by sea. This was a deliberate decision. Sea travel was faster but more dangerous. Ships could sink in storms. Armies could be stranded in hostile ports. The overland route was longer but more secure. The march began on May 11th, 1189. Frederick rode at the head of his army. Despite his age, he was still vigorous and active. He set an example for his men by sharing their hardships. He was a crusader like any other, dedicated to recovering the Holy Land. The first stage of the journey took the army through Hungary. King Bela III was friendly to the Crusaders. He provided supplies and guides. The march through Hungary was relatively easy. The army made good progress. From Hungary, the Crusaders entered Byzantine territory. This was where difficulties began. The Byzantine Empire had a complicated relationship with Western Crusaders. Previous expeditions had caused problems. The Byzantines were suspicious of Frederick's intentions. Emperor Isaac II, Angelus, ruled Byzantium. He was a weak ruler who faced many challenges. He feared that Frederick might try to conquer Constantinople. He took measures to hinder the Crusaders' progress. Byzantine officials refused to provide adequate supplies. They directed the Crusaders through difficult terrain. They spread rumours and misinformation. They did everything possible to slow the army down without openly attacking it. Frederick grew increasingly frustrated. He had negotiated passage rights before leaving Germany. The Byzantines were not honouring their agreements. The emperor began to consider more forceful options. At one point, Frederick threatened to attack Constantinople itself. He sent messages demanding that Isaac honour his commitments. He positioned his forces to threaten Byzantine territory. The situation came close to open warfare. Eventually, Isaac backed down. He agreed to provide transport across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. He supplied the Crusaders with provisions. he allowed them to continue their journey. But the delays had cost precious time. The crossing into Asia Minor took place in March 1190. The Crusaders were now in territory controlled by the Seljuk Turks. These were the enemies they had come to fight. The real dangers of the crusade were about to begin. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan II, was officially at peace with Frederick. He had promised safe passage through his lands, but his sons controlled much of the territory. They did not feel bound by their father's promises. Turkish raiders began harassing the Crusader army. They attacked stragglers and foraging parties. They ambushed small groups. They made the march increasingly dangerous. The Crusaders had to fight their way through hostile territory. The terrain itself was challenging. Asia Minor in spring could be beautiful, but it was also harsh. Water was scarce in many areas. Food was difficult to find. The army suffered from hunger and thirst. Despite these difficulties, Frederick pressed on. He maintained discipline in his army. He organised effective defences against Turkish attacks. He kept his men moving toward their goal. The old emperor proved that he had lost none of his military skill. The Crusaders won several engagements against Turkish forces. At the Battle of Philomelium, they defeated a large Turkish army. At Iconium, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate, they stormed the city and forced the Sultan to make peace. These victories opened the road to the Holy Land. The worst of the journey seemed to be over. The Crusaders had crossed the most dangerous territory. They were approaching the Christian territories of Armenia. From there, they could march to join the siege of Acre. Frederick's army entered the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia in early June 1190. The Armenians were Christians who welcomed the Crusaders. They provided food, water, and rest. After months of hardship, the army could finally recover. The Crusaders followed the Salef River, known today as the Goksu, through the Armenian highlands. The river provided water for men and horses. The valley offered a clear path through the mountains. Everything seemed to be going well. June 10th, 1190, began like any other day on the crusade. The army was marching through the Armenian highlands. The weather was warm. The river flowed beside them, offering relief from the heat. Frederick Barbarossa rode with his men, as he had done for over a year. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries. The sources disagree on the details, but the basic facts are clear. Frederick Barbarossa entered the Salef River and never came out alive. Some accounts say Frederick was trying to cross the river. The current was stronger than expected. His horse lost its footing. The emperor was swept away by the water. Other accounts say Frederick was bathing in the river. The water was cold from mountain snowmelt. The shock of the cold caused a heart attack or stroke. The emperor collapsed and drowned before anyone could reach him. Still other accounts suggest Frederick was simply wading in the shallows. He slipped on a rock and fell. Weighed down by his armour, he could not rise. He drowned in water that was barely waist deep. Whatever the exact circumstances, the result was the same. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, was dead. He was approximately 67 years old. He had reigned for 38 years. He died not in battle against his enemies, but in a river in a foreign land. The effect on the Crusader army was devastating. Frederick had been their leader, their inspiration, their symbol of hope. Without him, they were lost. The army that had marched so confidently began to fall apart. Some Crusaders simply gave up. They had come to follow Frederick. With him gone, they saw no reason to continue. They turned around and headed home. Thousands of men abandoned the crusade. Disease swept through the remaining army. The shock of Frederick's death weakened morale and resistance. Men who had survived Turkish attacks and desert marches succumbed to illness. The army shrank day by day. Frederick's son, Duke Frederick of Swabia, tried to hold things together. He assumed command of the remaining forces. He was determined to complete his father's mission. He would carry the crusade forward in his father's name. The younger Frederick faced an immediate problem. What should be done with his father's body? In the heat of an Anatolian summer, a corpse would quickly decay. The body could not be carried all the way to Jerusalem. The Crusaders tried to preserve Frederick's remains. They boiled the flesh from his bones, a common medieval practice for transporting important corpses. The bones could then be carried to the Holy Land for burial. But even this plan encountered difficulties. Some accounts say the bones were buried at Antioch. Others say they were buried at Tyre. Still others claim they were lost entirely. The final resting place of Frederick Barbarossa remains uncertain. The remnant of Frederick's army eventually reached Acre. This city was under siege by Christian forces. The Crusaders joined the siege, adding their strength to the effort. But they were only a shadow of the mighty host that had left Germany. Duke Frederick of Swabia died at Acre in January 1191. Disease claimed him, as it had claimed so many others. The Hohenstaufen leadership of the crusade was over. The German contribution would be remembered, but the glory would go to others. Richard the Lionheart of England arrived at Acre in the spring of 1191. He brought fresh troops and new energy. He took command of the crusade and eventually negotiated a settlement with Saladin. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed access. The Third Crusade was a partial success. It preserved a Christian presence in the Holy Land. It prevented Saladin from completely destroying the Crusader states, but it did not recover Jerusalem. Frederick Barbarossa's dream of liberating the Holy City died with him. News of Frederick's death reached Germany slowly. When it arrived, it caused grief and confusion. The great emperor was gone. The man who had ruled for nearly 4 decades would rule no more. Frederick's son Henry succeeded him as emperor. Henry VI would prove to be an able ruler in his own right. He completed the Sicilian marriage his father had arranged. He expanded Hohenstaufen power to its greatest extent. But his reign would be short. He died in 1197, leaving a child as his heir. The death of Henry VI plunged Germany back into civil war. The Hohenstaufen and Welf factions resumed their struggle. The unity that Frederick had created fell apart. The empire entered a period of chaos that would last for decades, but Frederick Barbarossa was not forgotten. His memory lived on in the hearts of his people. Stories about him spread across Germany. These stories grew and changed with each telling. They transformed the historical emperor into a legendary figure. The most famous legend claimed that Frederick was not really dead. He was only sleeping, waiting in a hidden cave beneath a mountain. Different versions placed this cave in different locations. The Kyffhauser mountain in Thuringia became the most popular site. According to the legend, Frederick sits at a stone table in his underground chamber. His red beard has grown through the table. Ravens fly around the mountain, keeping watch. When Germany faces its greatest need, Frederick will awaken. He will emerge from the mountain and restore the empire to glory. This legend persisted for centuries. It was revived during times of national crisis. When Germany was divided or threatened, people remembered the sleeping emperor. They hoped he would return to save them. The Kyffhauser legend reflected deep feelings about Frederick and what he represented. He symbolized German unity and strength. He represented a time when the empire was great and respected. He embodied the hope that such greatness could return. In the 19th century, German nationalists embraced the Barbarossa legend. They saw Frederick as a symbol of the unified Germany they hoped to create. When the German Empire was finally established in 1871, a massive monument was built on the Kyffhauser mountain. It featured a statue of Frederick awakening from his sleep. This monument still stands today. Visitors can climb to see the stone emperor emerging from the rock. It is a reminder of how powerful legends can be. A man who died over 800 years ago still captures the imagination. But we should not let the legend obscure the real Frederick Barbarossa. He was a flesh-and-blood man who lived in a specific time and place. He faced real challenges and made real decisions. He achieved genuine accomplishments and suffered genuine failures. The historical Frederick was remarkable enough without legendary embellishment. He ruled one of the largest empires in Europe for nearly 4 decades. He survived defeats that would have destroyed lesser men. He adapted to changing circumstances and learned from his mistakes. He left his mark on history in ways that are still felt today. Frederick Barbarossa's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was many things to many people. To his contemporaries, he was a powerful ruler who dominated European politics. To later generations, he became a symbol of German greatness. To historians, he remains a fascinating figure who shaped the medieval world. The immediate aftermath of Frederick's death was chaotic. His son Henry VI inherited a powerful position. The Hohenstaufen controlled Germany, Burgundy, and through marriage, the Kingdom of Sicily. The family seemed poised for even greater achievements. Henry VI was an ambitious ruler. He pursued his father's goals with even greater intensity. He dreamed of making the imperial crown hereditary in his family. He planned crusades and conquests. He accumulated power at a remarkable rate. But Henry died young in 1197 at the age of 32. His death left a 3-year-old boy as his heir. This child, who would become Frederick II, could not hold the empire together. Civil war erupted once again. The struggle between Hohenstaufen and Welf resumed with new fury. Otto of Brunswick, a Welf prince, claimed the imperial throne. Philip of Swabia, Frederick Barbarossa's youngest son, opposed him. Germany tore itself apart in renewed conflict. This civil war lasted for years. Philip was assassinated in 1208. Otto became emperor, but soon faced opposition. Young Frederick II eventually emerged victorious, but the damage to imperial authority was severe. Frederick II, Barbarossa's grandson, would become one of the most remarkable rulers in medieval history. He was called the wonder of the world for his learning and accomplishments. He ruled a vast empire and challenged papal authority, but he spent most of his reign fighting the same battles his grandfather had fought. The conflict between emperor and pope continued throughout Frederick II's reign. The popes excommunicated him repeatedly. They called crusades against him. They did everything possible to destroy Hohenstaufen power. Frederick II died in 1250. His sons and grandsons tried to maintain the dynasty, but they failed. The last Hohenstaufen, Conradin, was executed in 1268. The great family that Frederick Barbarossa had raised to glory was extinguished. The end of the Hohenstaufen marked a turning point in German history. The empire never recovered its former strength. The great interregnum that followed saw Germany without an effective ruler for decades. When the monarchy was restored, it was weaker than before. The territorial princes gained power at the expense of the crown. Germany became increasingly fragmented. The dream of a unified empire faded. Frederick Barbarossa's vision of strong central authority was never realized, yet Frederick's influence persisted in other ways. The legal and administrative innovations of his reign continued to shape German governance. The precedents he established guided later rulers. The institutions he created evolved but survived. Frederick's Italian policies also had lasting effects. The Peace of Constance became a model for imperial urban relations. The cities of northern Italy maintained their independence. They developed into the wealthy, cultured communities of the Renaissance. The struggle between emperor and pope that Frederick embodied continued for centuries. It shaped European politics and thought. It contributed to the eventual separation of church and state. The issues Frederick fought over remained relevant long after his death. Frederick Barbarossa also influenced how people thought about rulership. His combination of warrior prowess and political skill became a model for later kings. His image as a just and powerful ruler shaped expectations of monarchy. He helped define what it meant to be a medieval king. The cultural legacy of Frederick's reign was significant. The literature and art produced at his court influenced German culture for generations. The ideals of chivalry that flourished under his patronage shaped noble behaviour. The image of the perfect knight owed much to Frederick's example. Frederick's crusade, though it ended in tragedy, also left its mark. It demonstrated the continued appeal of the crusading ideal. It showed that even the greatest rulers felt compelled to defend the Holy Land. It contributed to the ongoing Christian engagement with the Muslim world. The legend of the sleeping emperor became perhaps Frederick's most enduring legacy. This story captured something essential about what Frederick meant to his people. He represented hope for a better future. He symbolized the possibility of renewal and restoration. The legend evolved over time. In its earliest forms, it was attached to Frederick II rather than Frederick Barbarossa. The grandson's dramatic life and mysterious death made him a natural subject for legend. But gradually, the story shifted to the grandfather. By the late Middle Ages, Frederick Barbarossa was firmly established as the sleeping emperor. The Kyffhauser mountain became his legendary resting place. The story spread throughout German-speaking lands. It became part of the national consciousness. The legend served different purposes at different times. During periods of division and weakness, it expressed longing for unity and strength. During periods of foreign domination, it promised eventual liberation. During periods of national awakening, it inspired hope for a better future. The 19th century saw the legend reach its greatest popularity. German nationalists embraced Frederick Barbarossa as a symbol of their cause. They saw in him the embodiment of German greatness. They believed his spirit would guide them to national unity. When the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, it was seen as the fulfillment of the Barbarossa legend. The emperor had awakened. Germany was united at last. The monument on the Kyffhauser celebrated this achievement. But history did not end in 1871. The German Empire that claimed Frederick's legacy lasted less than 50 years. It collapsed in the catastrophe of World War I. The hopes invested in the Barbarossa legend proved illusory. The 20th century brought new and darker uses of the legend. The Nazi regime appropriated Frederick Barbarossa for its own purposes. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, took its name from the medieval emperor. This association tainted the legend with the horrors of that era. After World War II, Germans had to reckon with how their history had been misused. The Barbarossa legend, like much of German national mythology, was viewed with suspicion. The sleeping emperor seemed less inspiring when his name had been attached to genocide and conquest. Yet Frederick Barbarossa himself was not responsible for how later generations used his memory. The historical emperor lived in a different world with different values. He cannot be blamed for crimes committed centuries after his death. Modern historians try to understand Frederick on his own terms. They study his reign in its medieval context. They analyse his policies and their effects. They assess his achievements and failures without romantic embellishment. This historical Frederick is more interesting than the legendary one. He was a real person who faced real challenges. He made decisions under pressure with imperfect information. He succeeded sometimes and failed sometimes. He was human. Frederick Barbarossa ruled during a transformative period in European history. Cities were growing and demanding rights. New ideas about law and government were spreading. The relationship between church and state was being redefined. Frederick participated in all these developments. His Italian campaigns, though ultimately unsuccessful, forced important questions about political authority. Who had the right to rule? What limits existed on power? How should conflicts between different authorities be resolved? These questions would continue to shape European politics for centuries. Frederick's relationship with the German nobles also raised important issues. How much power should a king have? What rights did nobles possess? How should the realm be governed? Frederick's answers to these questions influenced the development of German political institutions. The emperor's engagement with the church similarly shaped religious and political development. Frederick believed strongly in imperial authority over church affairs. He appointed bishops and abbots. He intervened in papal elections. He challenged papal claims to supremacy. This conflict between emperor and pope was not new. It had roots going back generations. But Frederick brought new intensity to the struggle. His support for anti-popes divided the church. His conflicts with Alexander III lasted decades. The issues he raised about church-state relations remained unresolved. Frederick's use of Roman law also had lasting significance. He employed legal scholars to justify his claims. He drew on ancient precedents to support imperial authority. He helped revive interest in classical legal traditions. This legal revival would have enormous consequences. Roman law became the foundation of legal education throughout Europe. It influenced the development of national legal systems. It provided concepts and principles that still shape law today. The emperor's court was a centre of cultural activity. Poets composed works in his honour. Scholars debated philosophical questions. Musicians performed for noble audiences. This cultural patronage helped establish traditions that would flourish for centuries. Frederick himself was remembered as a model of knightly virtue. He was brave in battle. He was generous to his followers. He was devoted to his family. He embodied the ideals that medieval society valued most. The stories told about Frederick illustrated these virtues. Chronicles described his courage at Legnano, fighting on foot after his horse was killed. They praised his determination in rebuilding after defeat. They celebrated his wisdom in making peace when war could not succeed. These stories were not always accurate. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated or invented details. They shaped their narratives to make moral points. They presented Frederick as they thought an emperor should be, not necessarily as he was. But the stories reveal what people valued. They show what qualities were admired in a ruler. They demonstrate the expectations placed on kings and emperors. In this sense, they tell us as much about medieval society as about Frederick himself. Frederick's family life also attracted attention. His marriage to Beatrice of Burgundy was celebrated as a model union. Their many children demonstrated divine favour. The dynasty they founded seemed destined for greatness. The Empress Beatrice was more than just a wife and mother. She was Frederick's partner in governing the empire. She accompanied him on campaigns. She advised him on policy. She represented him when he was absent. Her role showed that medieval queens could wield real power. Beatrice died in 1184, a few years before Frederick's final crusade. Her death was a personal blow to the emperor. They had been married for nearly 30 years. She had shared his triumphs and his trials. Her loss left him diminished. Frederick's children carried on his legacy after his death. Henry VI became emperor and expanded Hohenstaufen power. Other sons received duchies and titles. Daughters married into royal families across Europe. The dynasty Frederick built spread its influence far and wide, but dynasties rise and fall. The Hohenstaufen reached their peak under Frederick II and then collapsed. Within a century of Frederick Barbarossa's death, his family was extinct. The empire he had worked so hard to strengthen fragmented into competing territories. This outcome might seem to suggest that Frederick failed. All his efforts, all his campaigns, all his sacrifices led ultimately to nothing. The empire did not become the unified state he envisioned. His dynasty did not endure. Yet this judgment is too harsh. Frederick achieved much during his lifetime. He brought peace to a war-torn Germany. He established his family on the imperial throne. He maintained the empire's position as a major European power. He left a legacy that inspired generations. No ruler can control what happens after their death. Frederick could not foresee the early death of Henry VI or the civil wars that followed. He could not prevent the conflicts that would destroy his dynasty. He did what he could with the time he had, and what he did was remarkable. Frederick Barbarossa reigned for 38 years. He survived challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser men. He adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining his core vision. He earned the respect of friends and enemies alike. The emperor's death on crusade added a final chapter to his story. He died pursuing a noble goal. He died serving his faith. He died as he had lived, leading his men into danger. This ending seemed fitting for such a warrior. The mystery surrounding his death also contributed to his legend. The uncertainty about exactly what happened left room for imagination. The stories that grew up around his death transformed tragedy into myth. The sleeping emperor awaited his moment to return.